Hello, and welcome to this week's special bonus episode. As we have discussed previously, Hebrew, the language of the Old Testament, much like Greek, the language of the New Testament, is an image-based language. It paints an incredibly vivid and detailed picture, one that English simply fails to capture. It often requires entire paragraphs of English in order to convey the full idea that is captured and painted by a single Hebrew word. As I have been studying and translating the Hebrew words in the Psalms and Proverbs as part of my own attempt at a paraphrase translation hybrid, I have been fascinated and captivated by the richness of what truly lies in these texts. And so I have decided to share some of what I have found there, one digestible piece at a time. Last week, we started discussing the various tools that we would do well to train ourselves to use if we want our lives to be constructed well, instead of just ending up living in whatever pile of rubble we accidentally accumulate while we are here. So we started out by examining the idea of knowledge, which in Hebrew is the word da'at. And we learned that da'at is about comprehending the things that you experience and gaining a priceless, first-hand kind of knowledge as a result, the kind that has much more utility to it than learning advanced algebra does, at least for most people. From there, we moved on to wisdom, which in Hebrew is the word chokmah. Chokmah, we learned, is a genuine, probing curiosity, plus the skill to do something artistically constructive with the answers that you find. That led up to our discovery of sound wisdom, or teshaya, which is the solid essence that you uncover during your curious exploration. And having found it, then you build on it in order to have a life of substance with freedom, strategies, and results. Basically, teshaya describes efficient and direct approaches, ones that effectively hold up out in reality and produce those solid results. This week, we are going to continue combing through our toolbox of functional approaches to life. When you read about wisdom in the Bible, it is usually paired with another virtue, understanding. But this word doesn't really mean what you probably think it does. Understanding to us implies a full range of comprehension. But that is actually a little bit closer to what the Bible is describing when it talks about knowledge, although there is some overlap onto this word as well. When the Bible uses the word understanding, it is actually referring to what we would call discernment. The Hebrew word is tevuna. Tevuna is about developing a capacity for insightful analysis, especially when it comes to being able to separate things and to distinguish between them. This is about knowing where one thing ends and another thing begins. It is about going beneath the surface to gain a level of detailed understanding that most people are often in too big of a hurry to obtain, so their conclusions remain murky and muddled due to that lack of deliberate focus on accuracy. So if you go deeper and learn this rare skill, that gives you a clear and meaningful advantage over most people. Discernment is ultimately about having the capacity to distinguish between the various threads of a very tangled concept. Having discernment means that you have learned how to sort out complexities. This is about analyzing and separating out mixed truths. It is about sifting the solid from the BS, so that you are not building on the contents of a mixed bag instead of only a quality one. Discernment is the ability to define and to assess conflicting interests so that you can act accordingly. Tavuna is about the idea of carefully constructing your understanding of things discerningly, not blindly or wholesale. This virtue is about detail. It requires the increasingly rare ability to analyze, to distinguish between subtle differences, and to derive solid conclusions from the mixed information that you are taking in. Discernment is a way of life. It is not a momentary thing. It takes time and effort, not to mention a lot of skill. A skill that will expand with experience and use, like all skills do. Tavuna describes the kind of ongoing, insightful analysis that is developing an idea. It is not just a flash of insight. Discernment is also about acquiring the deeper level of comprehension that will allow you to fill in the how when it comes to assimilating your discerning insights into practical applications. Now, there are other words in Hebrew that are used to describe subtle variations of this idea, such as hiskalti, which is insightful perception and practical discernment. Then there is etbowanen, which implies the ability to comprehend and to separate, to grasp and discern. But the most common Hebrew word for understanding is bina. This word, like all of the others, is derived from the word ben, which means between, implying the ability to discern between things. This is describing the ability to sort out and categorize things accurately based on their small differences. Bina and Tavuna are basically the same thing. Any subtle differences between them typically represents different stages in this type of cognitive processing. The word bina is generally used to refer to the abstract, overarching concept of discernment. It is describing the analytical processing of an idea, while the word tavuna typically refers to the finer details of a truly thorough comprehension, such as the ability to derive even more levels of insight out of that acquired understanding, and ultimately to sort out the practical applications of whatever you discern. Or to put it another way, bina is about analyzing the big picture. It is about taking a general concept and through careful and concise deductive reasoning, mapping out an ordered, comprehensive system. This is about having the ability to understand the difference between one thing and another. Bina is having the power to differentiate between similar ideas and see the subtle overall structure in those existing differences. In Kabbalah, Bina represents the intellectual womb, the place that gives the abstract idea a carefully defined shape that is eventually ready to emerge and be used. Tavuna, on the other hand, is about analyzing the details. Tavuna is the slightly more functional aspect of Bina. If Bina is about discerning the big picture, then Tavuna takes that a step further. It is the ability to break down that big picture into each of the smaller components that it is made up of, and then outlining the details of those pieces, which enables maximal practical applications. Bina is about grasping the heart of the matter. Tavuna is the power to assimilate what you have grasped into your own life. It is about utilizing whatever conclusion it is that you have separated out and grasped intellectually. Basically, if bina is the ability to understand a musical composition that you have discovered, tavuna is the ability to actually play it on an instrument. Bina is more like an intellectual hall of mirrors, where you are processing things and trying to sort out the solid reality around you. Tavuna is more like an intellectual quarry, where you are not only discerning the best block of marble to extract, but you are then carving it into a practical object to be used for art or for construction, etc. But why is this skill of being able to separate things from each other so valuable in life? Because people intentionally and unintentionally give you mixed bags full of materials of all sorts of quality at all times. And if you cannot separate out the trash that should be discarded on its merits, however well-intentioned the giver was, then you will wind up constructing your life on it without knowing any better, without knowing that this piece was not solid. Allow me to give you a minor example of this. If someone was telling you the story of Moses striking the rock in the wilderness, and they told you that Moses was having a very bad day because his big sister had just died, and the people were nagging him again, and he called the people a bunch of contentious rebels, and then struck the rock, that would all be true. If that speaker went on to tell you that the reason that Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land was because Moses had been mean to the people, that would not be true. You have to be able to separate out subtleties in order to arrive at real truth. This one is obvious, given, but it still illustrates the point here. If I told you that the sun was shining when a criminal stole my car, and then I concluded that the criminal was arrested and had gone to jail because the sun was shining, I would be wrong about that. It is true that the sun was shining at the time, but it was the stealing the car part that led to the arrest and incarceration, which is a useful thing to know if you don't want to break the law and if you prefer to learn as much as you can from other people's experiences. Likewise, it is true that Moses called the people a pretty accurate name in his anger that day. You would even be correct in saying that it was not a very nice thing to do. But the Bible is very, very clear that the act that led to him being kept out of the promised land was the part where he hit the rock, which represented God himself. The sun was shining when a crime took place, but that was not the crime itself. Moses did speak angrily to the people, but that is not the thing that he was punished for. He was punished for taking a swing at God. Now, you can even make the argument that Moses should not have said what he did to the people, and that it was wrong for him to do that. That's going to require a whole other level of subtlety to sort out whether that claim is true or not. But regardless, the claim that Moses was kept out of the promised land for calling the people a pretty mild name because he was not being nice, and that was not nice to do, that claim is not true. It has some truth mixed in with it, which is that Moses did yell at the people. That is true. And it was not nice to do that, which is not necessarily the same thing as saying that it was wrong to do that, but you can credibly say that it was not nice, which is also true. That is where the truth ends. When you stretch that tiny bit of truth into the conclusion that the reason that Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land with the rest of his people was because he was mean to them, now you have crossed the line into untruth, because the Bible is very, very clear that Moses was not allowed into the promised land because of the act of striking the rock. Among many other places in Scripture that state that fact even more clearly, in the story of Numbers 20 itself, verse 12 clearly says, "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." Analysis of the things that you hear in life is important, because you are going to hear a lot of things in this world. You are going to constantly be told things that are a mixed bag, and not always intentionally so. But the intention doesn't change the fact that you might now be building on empty untruths. And an untruth is not going to hold up because it is not solid. It is empty and illusionary. Yet this is going to happen to you 24/7. So you have to be able to analyze in order to determine the precise moment when the truth ended and speculation or pure untruth began. The next word that I want to look at today is one that describes a wonderful tool, one that is very much undervalued but incredibly beneficial. Common sense. The Hebrew word for this is sekel. Sekel is the ability to reason clearly and to apply good judgment or common sense to a situation. This word is all about the kind of intelligence that is functional, not theoretical. Sekel is practical common sense. It describes a helpful kind of insightfulness. This is a sound, functional wisdom, one that works, by which I mean that it produces successful outcomes. In this, it is not unlike Teshaya, but sekel is even less theoretical than sound wisdom is. Sekel is reality through and through. This is about having functional smarts, the kind of working savvy that is optimal for basic survival, which is one of the things that this skill successfully produces. Sekel is all about its output, the thing that it produces. That is almost entirely what defines it. Sekel isn't about being smart in a classroom. It is about acting smart. This is the Hebrew inversion of the Forrest Gump quote, "Stupid is as stupid does." Sekel is the claim that smart is as smart does. It isn't about looking or sounding wise among a hall of intellectuals. It is about acting wisely in your life. But by its very nature, sekel implies success, because acting with wise insight automatically leads to good results. This is about valuing, not dismissing, a practical common sense that produces functional outcomes for you. That is no small thing. Sekel is about the gift of clarity that comes from having this practical kind of common sense. The clarity is what makes it functional. You may have noticed that many intellectual types whose field of wise expertise is an entirely theoretical one often wind up tying themselves into confused intellectual knots. The problem is, because of the very nature of their theoretical field, they are not grounded in the reality of results. Now, don't get me wrong. They are extremely intelligent people, but in a very dysfunctional way. They are geniuses, just not very useful ones. Sekel implies a practical, savvy grasp of the true situation, the one that is directly facing you, rather than having just some advanced theoretical knowledge whose utility is, at the very least, debatable. When you have Sekel, you have the ability to understand complex situations and the prudence to act with caution while showing discretion. And discretion is where we're going to pick up next week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, I would ask you to please help me build this podcast into a success by clicking the like and follow buttons, because that is what does the trick in making these things successful, and it doesn't cost anything to do. Plus, it lets me know which kind of content you are enjoying so that I can make more of that kind of content for you. And I hope that you come back again next week. Until then, have a good week, my friends.